Hello, welcome back to the Simply Scrupulosity podcast. I am your host, Abby Tabilos, and this is episode number 27. And the title of this episode, which you already know because you clicked on it, but it is basically me typing out one of my number one intrusive thoughts that I used to have surrounding my scrupulosity obsessive-compulsive disorder. And I will say, shortly after I was initially diagnosed, the therapist that diagnosed me said, just so you know, the other name that we use to refer to obsessive compulsive disorder is the doubting disorder. And she basically explained to me that a lot of people just kind of assume that OCD is some branch of an anxiety disorder, which surprisingly is actually inaccurate because while OCD does obviously have a component of anxiety, it is its own thing. And as you know, I've talked extensively about the OCD cycle and how you go through intrusive thoughts, anxiety, compulsions, relief of anxiety, and you just kind of keep going around and around and around and around and around. She explained to me that as part of that OCD cycle, those intrusive thoughts often center around doubts. Because we do know that a big part of treatment for OCD is learning how to be comfortable with uncertainty. So, of course, doubting certainty and being uncertain is a very large part of OCD in general. But what most people do not know is that those doubts that are part of OCD know almost no boundaries. I would bet that the majority of people tuned into this episode who have OCD will relate to me when I say one of the first things that my mind did after I was diagnosed and kind of began treatment was instill doubt that I actually had OCD. And it did so through a multitude of different avenues. Initially, it was just that, oh, well, your therapist may just be assuming that you have OCD, but there's a very big chance that she could be wrong because you just want attention. And then there were also times where the OCD had me questioning whether I basically had been faking or pretending to have OCD symptoms for some benefit. I mean, at the time it was terrifying, but obviously when you look back, it's like, why on earth would anyone pretend to have OCD? I'm sure someone out there has a reason, but I remember, I think it was 3 or 4 weeks after my initial diagnosis. It was in that really difficult part where you're just starting to learn enough about OCD and what it is that you're starting to recognize the pattern. You're starting to be able to say, oh, I just got an intrusive thought. Oh, that must be why I'm feeling anxious. Oh, this is the compulsion I want to do and I'm not supposed to. And because OCD takes up so much of a person's life, it can be overwhelming because you start to realize, okay, basically I have no real personality. Everything I've ever been doing and have done has been the OCD the whole time. And how am I ever going to get better because this OCD is so deeply ingrained into my everyday life that I'm not sure how I'm ever going to untangle it. So I was having that moment of being overwhelmed, and the anxiety was super high because obviously I'm aware of my compulsions and I'm trying not to do them. And I just had, fight, flight, or freeze. I had a freeze moment. And my husband was at work at the time. And I just sat down on the couch and I was feeling super, super panicky. And then that is when the intrusive thought that maybe I didn't have OCD came up. And it was so interesting. That was the first time that ever happened to me. So I wasn't expecting it, and I wasn't quite sure how to handle it. And because I was so new at approaching OCD and OCD recovery, of course, I had an emotional attachment to that intrusive thought, and I took it seriously, and I bought into the anxiety. And then I worried, what actually is wrong with me? And then my brain spiraled, and I remember just wanting to scream at my brain to just be quiet and to just stop reeling and sending me thoughts. And at that time, we hadn't necessarily nailed down what type of OCD I had. That took 6 months to, I think, almost a year later, before my therapist said she was confident it was scrupulosity. But as we got closer and closer to working specifically on scrupulosity and unveiling those themes, I remember that initial doubt was twisted, and it caught me off guard, because as we started doing the exposure therapy of, okay, today, Abby, your ERP, your exposure and response prevention therapy assignment is don't pray. Or today, your ERP assignment is don't repent. Or this week, don't go to church on Sunday, even though you're not sick. And it's then that things got really real, because for some reason, when I was working on some of the other themes of OCD that I have, the ERP was still very difficult for me to do, but the stakes of what would happen to me if I didn't do the compulsion were less. It wasn't getting into scrupulosity OCD territory where it began to be, oh, I need to repent. And if I don't repent, my eternal salvation is at stake. So the door opened, and the ERP felt so much more scary and terrifying. And it was then that I started to have the doubts of, this is why you were pretending to have OCD, because secretly, all along, you wanted to sin and you didn't want to be obedient to God. And now I got you. And now I know that you just wanted to use the OCD as an excuse. That was difficult, because it was such a good idea for the OCD to use that as a way to keep me trapped, because it made me not want to do the ERP. It made me terrified. And I was so concerned that God in the next life would come up to me and say, you know, you never had OCD. And you just used it as an excuse to get out of doing the right things. And so all of that to say, number one, just know that I genuinely think every person who has obsessive-compulsive disorder has dealt with something along these lines at some point. When I brought these types of things up to my therapist, she would literally laugh and say, oh, yep, no one believes they have OCD. So how do you move forward when the doubting disorder makes you doubt that you have the disorder? Especially in the context of scrupulosity, where the doubting disorder makes you doubt that God understands you and knows you have OCD, and that these exposures that you're doing to literally save your mental health, improve your quality of life, get to a healthier place are for the better. And that things with religion and morality are not so cut and dry. What do you do? And how do you move forward? Because if there's one thing that I know, it's that telling somebody with Scrupulosity OCD, God understands you and he knows you have OCD, and he will take that into account at Judgment Day. Saying those words is kind. It's a very, very kind thing to do, but it's not effective because of the nature of the doubting disorder, and it's not going to penetrate that intrusive thought and get rid of it. And so what do? Because you don't want to go throughout your whole life thinking God thinks you're making all this up. But the answer to that is these doubts and wondering if God thinks you're using Scrupulosity OCD as an excuse are intrusive thoughts. We can fit it right into the OCD cycle. The intrusive thought is God thinks you're using Scrupulosity OCD as an excuse. Then you feel anxious. And then you want to do a compulsion. You want to ask your therapist, well, are you really sure that I have OCD? You want to ask a lot of people for reassurance. I feel like that would be the most common. You want to maybe do some research, symptoms of Scrupulosity OCD, or you want to pray and ask for reassurance from God that he knows you're not faking it. Insert compulsion here. And then that anxiety might go down a little bit, but someday again, you're going to get the intrusive thought and wonder and think, God thinks I'm using this Scrupulosity OCD as an excuse and I don't actually have it. We must treat that doubt as we would any other intrusive thought, which is by moving towards our values first and foremost, not doing compulsions, and sitting with the anxiety and the uncertainty that comes up. And obviously everybody has different core values. Mine, just off the top of my head, that I use a lot in my OCD recovery are wisdom, practicality, self-respect. And so you could respond to that intrusive thought by saying, you know what, maybe God thinks I'm using this air quote diagnosis as an excuse, but I really value respecting myself, and that in this moment for me means that I am going to act as if I do have OCD, and that means doing my treatment and doing my ERP. And so I'm not going to ask for reassurance or do research. Instead, I'm going to acknowledge that I'm feeling anxious and uncomfortable, and I am going to go read my favorite book right now instead, or whatever activity you want to do. I'm going to get back to work. I'm going to write, whatever. As you practice acknowledging, not ignoring that intrusive thought, acknowledging it, taking a second to feel the anxiety, not doing the compulsion. Eventually, because you're not giving positive reinforcement to that intrusive thought, you're not giving it attention, you're not doing the compulsion, you're not giving into the fear, that intrusive thought will lose its power over you. And that emotional attachment that you have to it will eventually dissipate. I'm not saying you'll never get that intrusive thought again. I'm not saying you're never going to doubt or worry about this ever again. But what I am saying is that when it comes up, you'll just be able to say, you know, there's that doubt again. And it will almost be one of those things like you're greeting an old friend. As I have practiced this and practiced dealing with this doubt throughout my 2 to 3 years since I've been diagnosed with OCD, or maybe longer now, I lose count sometimes, I have learned that I value believing that if there is a God, because I can't be certain about anything. That's what I do in my OCD recovery. I'm not certain about anything. I'm not even certain that this sweater is yellow that I'm wearing. That if there is a God, he would be so much more compassionate and understanding than I used to think he was. And that if someday I stand before a higher power, or I stand before God, and I am accountable for the exposures I did, or how my relationship with certainty and faith has changed, that I will not only have gotten to a place where I value my values, like self-respect, enough to know I had OCD, I believed I had OCD, I had all the symptoms of OCD, and I got to a healthier place. And I wasn't certain whether I was doing the right thing all the time, but I believe that this God and higher power is compassionate and understanding enough and loving enough to have seen those moments of struggle that it took to get there. And moving towards that value was an exposure in and of itself. And it was much harder to say that at first. I felt like an imposter. But now I'm comfortable with the uncertainty and with what I value and believe. And I make choices every day based on that. And at the end of the day, that's what OCD recovery is all about. So if you're still in the very beginning, doubt and difficulty of wondering if God thinks you're making all this up to use it as an excuse, I will leave you with this. Maybe he does think you're using it all as an excuse. And maybe he doesn't. I will talk to you next week.